Okay, good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing? You got lunch? That's good. Well, we're honored to be here today, and all three of us have worked together before, and so it's nice to be here together in a different capacity today. And so I appreciate everything. First of all, appreciate everything that you all do to serve our nation, whatever capacity that you are in, whether it's DHS or CBP or components of DHS, our industry, you play a really big role in that. Academia plays a really big role in that too, with research and development, and so on and on and on. But I want to thank also the HSDF personnel that do these forums on very relevant topics all of the time. And so with that, we have law enforcement and military coordination on border operations. And so that's the title of this panel. And then obviously we'll go into Q&A towards the end of the panel, and looking forward to the questions. But in terms of just to set the strategic stage, and I just retired in January from United States Southern Command, and I was one of the 6 geographic combatant commands under Department of War. And the region that I had was South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, and working with our 31 countries, working with their militaries, their public security forces on contingency operations, planning, training, all those kinds of things. And so everything that is happening in the Caribbean right now is what I said was needed, all that attention. And it is there now. Prior to that, I was in Army North. I was Army North Commander under US Northcom. We were the Army Component Command and have the active duty military that provides support to CBP on the southwest border. And so really myself, John King, and Manny Padilla worked together. And John King was my contingency command post commander for Task Force 51. And Manny was the JTF West director. And prior to that, long careers. So 38 years Army, John King, 41 years National Guard from Georgia Guard, as well as 31 years in law enforcement. He started in the Atlanta Police Force and then was the chief of police in Doraville, Georgia. And then certainly Manny Padilla, who is a legend in CBP, Chief Border Patrol agent in Rio Grande Valley, Tucson, New Orleans, and then last assignment as JTF West. And we worked together in San Antonio. So with that, we have, just to set the strategic stage, we have, under Trump 1, we had the national emergency on the southwest border that was declared. 2025, first day in office, same thing, right? National emergency, southwest border. We've had executive orders come out under each one, Trump 1, Trump 2. Executive order in Trump 2 really focused on having the military and giving the military more authorities to support CBP in their operations. And so we've seen an increase, quite a bit of an increase in military that have gone to support CBP. When I was a commander of Army North, we had a brigade combat team that was under Army North and Northcom. And now you have a division headquarters with quite a bit more capability, as well as 3 brigades that are in support of CBP. And so, and then, of course, we have our national security strategy that just came out last week, right? And so Homeland, as we would expect, is #1 priority, and it has been, right? But the difference here is now the Western Hemisphere has been added as a priority. And the Western Hemisphere, which is the hemisphere with which I commanded in US Southern Command, right? There's a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine for the Western Hemisphere. And what does that mean? And it means to keep non-hemispheric strategic adversaries from coming into the region, from gaining and controlling critical assets, from bringing military into the region, and from doing critical infrastructure builds. Quite a bit. And so when I got into Southcom, I will tell you that I was, as I learned about the region, studied up on the region, shocked at what part of our strategic adversaries have been able to do over the previous decade. 23 of 31 countries signed on to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. That's significant because that is all big billions of dollars worth of projects into critical infrastructures in the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. Deep water ports, space, 5G, safe city, smart city technology, as we know that's surveillance technology. Most PRC enabling space infrastructure in the Western Hemisphere than anywhere else in the globe. That should concern us. And from a military perspective, seeing China with their the largest buildup of military forces since World War II in conventional and nuclear forces. So what I look at is being able to flip the use of that from state-owned enterprises, which are controlled by the government that run these companies, and being able to use that for military application, right? And so, just back to the broader strategic framework, not to mention the rare earths, the critical minerals. 60% of the world's lithium is in the Western Hemisphere. You've got lithium, you've got Chile, that's the #1 producer of copper, which we need for technology. Brazil, #3 in the world for nickel. So as we talk about all these critical minerals, which are key to everything that you need, DHS, CBP, AMO, ICE, HSI, all the technology that we need, Defense Department, relies on our ability to have access to these critical minerals and rare earths. So it's not surprising to me why the national security strategy has included all these things. So as we think about everything that's happened over the past 11 months, and we look at how the military has been used in support of CBP and DHS. And so, as we talk about through the panel today, also I think authorities are really, really important. Those are all the things that allow us to do things or really restrict our ability to do certain things. And certainly between the Department of War and DHS, those authorities that we have or don't have are critical to the mission set and critical to being successful or not. But, I'll throw a question out there in terms of, as we've seen the deployment of the military, I talked about the increase of military support to CBP, but now we're also seeing deployments of National Guard to different cities within the United States. And we're seeing different reactions to that, right? From political leaders to state leaders to, government officials and those sorts of things. And so, is this the new norm for our military? Because, our military has to be ready to fight our nation's wars, right? As we're dealing with our internal security and those sorts of things. And then also, let's not forget that and it's been mentioned before today, is the World Cup that's coming very, very quickly. And then, oh, by the way, on the heels of that, 2 years later, is the LA Olympics. And are we ready? Are we ready to tackle that? And how do we transform and we keep technology at the forefront, but we're able to iterate it in quick enough that we can stay ahead of our adversaries as they quickly adapt? But back to authorities and back to the military deploying to all these cities, and then the different authorities by which the military operates under. So I'll throw that one to Major General retired John King first, and we'll talk about all the different authorities out there.
A great deal of you hear a lot of news about the military being in our communities, and I will tell you, as a career National Guard officer who's deployed overseas multiple times, is the authorities is everything, and most people do not. I think don't understand a little bit about the authorities. Governors routinely call National Guard soldiers. In Georgia, we've called them up every time there's a snowstorm. We don't do snowstorms very well in Georgia, as you can imagine. And so we called tornadoes. So nobody even blinks an eye. And governors have the greatest deal of authority to give to National Guard soldiers when they're under that authority of the governor. They can participate in law enforcement type activities. Now, as an advisor to our governor, and as also a retired police chief, I always have cautioned not only our governors to use National Guard soldiers to relieve the task, the mundane task of law enforcement officers. So when it comes time to go and arrest potentially U.S. citizens, it's not somebody in a military uniform. And most governors understand that, and they use that. But that ability that when the president and the Secretary of War calls out, activates National Guard under Title 10, which is a completely different title, those authorities are non-existent. And so the use of National Guard soldiers then translate into securing federal facilities, providing logistical support. Again, the same formula to relieve the tasks, the mundane tasks, to free up federal agents so they can go and enforce. But you have to understand those authorities very carefully, because that sets the stage on how we use National Guard soldiers. Now remember, National Guard soldiers have regular jobs every day. And so every time we call up National Guardsmen, in Georgia, when I was a commander of an infantry brigade deploying to Afghanistan, 9% of my soldiers were police officers, EMTs, and corrections officers. So there's a cost to our communities and the capabilities of our communities every time we mobilize our soldiers. And of course, the Department of Defense is incredible. The Department of War and National Guard soldiers incredibly capable, have incredible amount of equipment, incredible amount of capabilities, but it comes at a cost. We are expensive because you have to pay all those capabilities, the salaries, and those things that typically are not programmed. And so that has to be part of that discussion. But unfortunately, the Department of War and National Guard have become the easy button for any time there's a crisis. I mean, we called border, COVID, you name it, World Cup, we're going to be mobilizing National Guardsmen to assist in our communities. And of course, that unfortunately I think has become the new normal, but it comes at a cost.
So I would say when we were in Army North, we had a situation on the southwest border. We had active duty. We had National Guard that was mobilized on active duty, mobilized on Title 10 orders, serving that. But then we also had the National Guard for the state of Texas working for the Department of Public Safety for Texas, and then all supporting, so we're all there together. Military all wearing like the same uniform, but in some cases under different authorities, right? And that can get confusing. But Chief Padilla, thoughts on the authorities and those sorts of things, and this new normal, or do we just need to invest in building the capacity that CBP needs to have? Because we've been at this for quite a while. This was supposed to be initially a temporary thing, right? But now here we are almost at 2026, and we first started with this really at 2019 for the series that we're talking about.
Thank you, General. So I'll segue into 2018, 2019, when we deployed the military under Title 10 to deal with the caravans. That's when I started working closely with Army North, General Buchanan, and then General Richardson, and of course, mi compadre aquí que habla puro español, dealing a lot with Mexico, right? So is it the new norm? I think it's important for us to think in this construct here. If you look at the convergence of the threats that we're facing, there is no more alien smuggling organizations, drug trafficking organizations, terrorists. It's just a mix of cartels will move anything they need to in order to make money. And one thing that was very telling to me is during the last couple of years of the previous administration, when we were seeing those surges, the majority of the murders in Juarez were cartel members killing each other over territory to smuggle not drugs, but smuggle aliens. So when you see that convergence of the threat, I think it absolutely warrants a coming together of U.S. capabilities to include the military, to include state and local, tribal, and in partnership with those countries that will work with us. I think we heard a lot today about the efforts that are being done on the border, personnel, technology as the foundation, intelligence. All that is great, and the results you can see very, very well. What I would propose is that we actually have to extend the border outward, because on the avenues of approach, we cannot be in a situation as we go into the future that we do not know what's on the south side of that wall. So for example, the tunneling threat, the subterranean threat. When we discover one here in the US and we backtrack it to where it started, there's been piles of dirt for the last 3-4 months that are happening on the south side that you talk about an indicator of something happening. We need to remove the anonymity of the cartels in that border area. We need to know exactly who they are, what they're doing, how they're doing it, in partnership with those countries, and stop those illicit flows prior to approaching the immediate border area.
I may add, Manny, you reminded me of our time, coordinating with the Northern, with the Border Commanders Conference, in learning from with our friends from Sedena on their first encounter with fentanyl. Yep. It was one of their checkpoints. Young soldiers saw a truck full of Sprite, bottles of Sprite, and one of the soldiers turned around and opened one of them and drank it. He was dead immediately. And that was the first indicator that we had to start paying attention to personal protection. Well, how do we train our soldiers? This is not something innate that we train soldiers. We don't even train police officers in this kind of stuff. But that was the first indicator. And I think had we had that vision of looking into and having those relationships and that access. And so that's why coordination is the key word in this, is the military law enforcement coordination is key, because we have a responsibility not only to protect our deployed assets, our soldiers, our agents, and of course our communities. Yeah. But that was a shocker to me back in 17.
Yes, absolutely.
So what we, in US Southcom, the last figure, in fact, my successor testified in March, and we have a graphic of all the transnational organized crime and the historical drug trafficking routes within the region. And so, but annually, and it continues to increase every year, we had come up with the number of 358 billion. When I was still the commander, it was 310 billion. But it just continues to go up every year. That is 358 billion annual revenue business is what we factored in the Western Hemisphere. And so when you even add up the military budgets of all the countries, it doesn't even come close to that. And so how do we break this vicious cycle? Because it's not just drugs, it's also people, it's illegal mining, it's illegal fishing, it's illegal logging, it's all the illegal stuff. And it's very, very rampant in the Western Hemisphere. And so how do we break that cycle? How do we follow the money? Who's doing all the money laundering, right? How is it all happening? Because it's happening right here, very close to our homeland. And quite honestly, the reason I think why the national security strategy put Western Hemisphere along with the homeland as a priority, right? As we talk about cross-border coordination, can we do better at that, right? I mean, me as a commander in the Western Hemisphere, there's a long history with all the countries fighting amongst each other, right, as enemies and having to protect their border. But then as I would talk to them, I'm like, okay, we're 28 like-minded democracies out of the 31 countries in the region. You need to quit squabbling amongst each other because right under our nose, you've got China with Huawei, and 23 of the countries have signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative. You know, a lot of you have Huawei backbones, so the stealing of data, the sabotage that's happening right under your nose. You can't see troops massing on the border. You don't have alarms bells going off when they're hacking your data. We have in our own country examples of Salt Typhoon, Volt Typhoon, right? On our telecommunications networks here in the US, on our critical infrastructure here in the US, right? And what are we doing to protect that? But cross-border coordination. And so when we think about our own US border with Mexico, right? Our own US border with Canada, do we have the same communication? Can we talk to each other? Or do we have to talk to each other on WhatsApp, right? If we even have each other's numbers. And so trying to foster that, Colombia and Ecuador, border problems, that's where the borders are normally the seams with which cartels and the transnational organized crime happens. So how do we better work with our partners?
So, ma'am, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
You know, I think when I was down at RGB and working with Manny, we would deal with, for example, Webb County Sheriff's Department, Laredo. And they would have a shooting in Nuevo Laredo, and the suspects would go to the American side. And there was no effective way of communicating between Sedena and the Mexican, Policía Estatal or the Policía Federal and the U.S. component in a secure means, which to me was crazy. And so we had some incredible challenges in coming out with a program of record of being able to establish secure communications capabilities with our partners on the other side. And it was our authorities and what what the department, at that time, DOD, support to law enforcement versus support to Sedena. And so we need a little bit more work on being able to clarify how do we support, because the Mexican military established La Guardia Nacional, which are military policemen from Sedena who just changed uniforms, are still getting a salary from La Secretaría Nacional de Defensa. But then all of a sudden we were blocked from assisting them because they were now technically law enforcement. To me, it's just the clarity. And we would hit our heads against a brick wall because of authorities and U.S. Obstacles.
Let me dig a little bit into the Western Hemisphere. So from a military and actually law enforcement perspective, if you look at the Western Hemisphere, to me, that's the avenue of approach. And now that you're seeing the efforts that this administration has taken to quell illegal immigration, illegal drugs, et cetera. And my colleagues here will assert to this, that all those governments that saw the flows as mission impossible, guess what they're doing now? They're actually securing their own borders because nobody wants to get stuck with those flows in their respective countries. So what the U.S. is doing right now, as far as prioritizing the Western Hemisphere, it's actually making those countries better. It's a forcing mechanism for them to govern instead of just being a thoroughfare to the U.S. So that's one thing. The other thing that comes to mind too is that who's our number one trading partner with the U.S.? It's Mexico. Yep. Mexico is the number one trading partner with the U.S. So for industry and actually for leaders, because every partnership requires two main things, right? You need the leadership to have the willingness to work together and to get to yes. That's the number one thing. And then secondly, here comes the systems parts where you have the systems, the ability to share information, the ability to share data. That's where industry comes in. So two main parts. When we look at that southwest border, and it's, again, Mexico being the number one trading partner, that area should be designated by both countries as a crime-free zone. No cartel activity at all, right? Because that's of interest to both countries. I think Mexico is very interested in being the number one trading partner. I think the U.S. is interested in having Mexico as a number one trading partner. We have the technology, we have the capability, the law enforcement capability to designate it just like you would a crime-free zone and a school zone, right? And say, hey, we are monitoring this area together. We're leveraging the technologies, the surveillance technology. We're sharing information, the proverbial common operating picture, common intelligence picture. Having those joint commands, because as General King said, and I've been retired less than a year, but we were communicating WhatsApp in very informal ways. In today's world, do we have the ability to establish secure communications with partners that we work with? I believe that we do. So we need to take that leap and make that truly a security and prosperity model, because security and prosperity go hand in hand. You cannot have a prosperous trade zone if your security is all messed up. As we speak today, there is the trucking industry that moves goods from the U.S. into Mexico. They have to stop at the border and pay so much money to the cartels. And that stays quiet. It stays quiet because, hey, there could be repercussions if you say something. As we speak today, there is refined fuel that is smuggled from the U.S. into Mexico, cartel making money, fueling the violence, whatever things the cartels do, and it's almost in plain view. So if you really focused and establishing this a crime-free zone and have it as a model of security and prosperity, I think you have, again, the capability, the law enforcement capability and expertise, both in the military and in the law enforcement realms. And then you have, with you all, the technology to be able to implement secure systems to be able to establish again, the common operating picture, common intelligence picture. I know it's a bold step, but if we were to do something like this, that would be long-lasting. That's not something that one administration could come and take away, because that is a binational priority to both. Yeah.
Okay, so a lot of talk about technology today, obviously, and the speed of technology, the speed of relevance, having capability, how to stay ahead of your adversaries. And what we look at that should be getting approved next week, voted on by the Senate, and then to the President's desk is the National Defense Authorization Act. And so the NDAA has quite a bit of profound acquisition reform in it for the Department of War. And having listened to the leaders for the Army, I'm a retired Army, so I stay really plugged into what the Army's doing. Transforming in contact, TIC, and that's what the Army is doing. And they're getting away from programs of record, because programs of record are locking the Army and have locked the Army into programs that just become legacy programs, right? That you continue to try to bolt on technology to it, and then you find yourself on version 15 of the same thing from the 1950s or the 1980s or something like that, right? And so they're going to what's called the characteristics of need, and being able to stay ahead and move fast and iterate technology. They're going to try to achieve to become lighter, mobile, low signature, decentralization, those sorts of things. Department of War, the Secretary of War has directed the Army to be the executive agent for JIATA 401, Joint Interagency Task Force 401, excuse me, which has been talked about already, for counter-UAS, small UAS. And also they are standing up a Task Force X, which is a focus on robotics and manufacturing. Budget line consolidation, having the right to repair on equipment, instead of having like 200 parts to a system, creating things and having industry help them create things that have like 10 parts, right? And when you talk about right to repair, so the Army, which is pretty big, doesn't have to have like field service representatives, FSRs that always have to be there to repair stuff, right? Because the soldiers can't, because they don't have the right to repair, those sorts of things. So the Department of War is moving out and trying to figure out, right? Because if you look at what's happened between Russia and Ukraine, and you look at what has happened between those two countries, right? Russia having the ability to industrialize really, really fast. Their army can't fight, but by God, they can industrialize pretty doggone quickly, right? The superpower that Ukraine has is that they can take the battlefield changes and they come back and they can change how they're doing things, their tactics, and then they can change how they're implementing things and what they're employing, right? So that's their superpower. And so as we think through, and we think through our mission and the security of our homeland, safer, stronger, more prosperous, now also the Western Hemisphere, right? Safer, just increasing that bubble out, safer, stronger, more prosperous. We think about the technologies that are needed on the border. Is the border networked? Is there persistent surveillance? Are we able to see? Do we have domain awareness of everywhere on the border, right? When we're talking about increasing capacity and capability, do we need the military to support CBP because there's not enough CBP, right? So I will tell you that just in terms of what the direction that the Army is going, unless it's AI enabled, they're not gonna fool with it, right? And so how do we move out with all the technology that's available? A lot of money being put into DHS at this point, but how do you take advantage of that and all those capabilities? Are the industry days that are taking place, are those actually enough, right, for people to be able to showcase what the latest technology is? Because I think there's things out there that's available now that can help.
Ma'am, I'll take a shot at that. When I first deployed in, I think, 2017 to the border as Task Force 51 commander, we were given the guidance to go and prepare bring in the brigade combat team. Your mission, expect the mission to last between 6 to 9 months so we can buy time for DHS to hire enough CBP assets to be able to deal with the border, with the challenges, and that's the caravans at that time. We haven't left the border. And of course, I don't want to alarm anybody. The United States Army has been on the U.S.-Mexico border since 1829. So this was not, so we've always, this has been part of the mission set, of course at much lower levels. But the problem is that the Army had it had capabilities that were generic capabilities that they could be thrown at this because we had a force ready to respond across the nation. The CBP did not. DHS did not have the infrastructure to be able to grow that fast. And so that's one of the challenges. And of course, remember, the threat, the cartels are constantly innovating as well. They're taking lessons learned from Ukraine and the Russian conflict. They're taking, they're taking lessons learned from Israel, from Gaza, and they're applying it to their tactics and techniques. So they're very, when money is no object, you have incredible capacity to be able to attract talent and to be able to put technology, and they're not governed or restricted by who they buy equipment from. And so the ability to innovate, the programs of record are not made to be able to adapt as quickly. And so I'm glad that the Department of War is changing the whole outlook on how we go after technology, because the speed of innovation is so, you all are doing so well of innovating and putting products out there. There are Cold War systems to acquiring equipment and the training pipeline are not set up for that. And so we're having to speed up and catch up because the innovation is incredible.
No, absolutely. You bring up a good point. And I know it's been spoken about earlier, like how do we speed up procurement? I think that's one of the main barriers that we have. But from an operator perspective, I mean, we don't get into the whole how are we going to procure. It's like, hey, I need this right now at the speed of mission. I think somebody mentioned the speed of mission. But I'll give you an example of what it looks like in the border environment. I will say about 7 to 10 years ago, one of the biggest threats that we were facing, which was a new threat, was the use of ULAs, ultralight aircraft. And our challenges were like, AMOC could not track them because they're slower and they fly lower. Anyways, it was a problem tracking those, right? And then you had to be right on top of them because the only way to spot them is contact by chance. And then we had a lot of reports from the community that, hey, I see this thing buzzing over my house, et cetera, right? So we started looking at that, coming up with solutions to counter that threat. By the time we got to a solution for that threat, it was obsolete. It was a dinosaur then. Now you got the SUASs, the drones, that have taken the place of those things. So from an operator perspective, you see the threat evolving extremely, extremely fast. No limitations on procurement, no limitations on getting experts to develop these things for their use. So we have to look for ways on how to get that technology at the speed of mission. And as far as technology goes, I think it's been touched on as well, but I think that when industry is developing technologies, right now, General King mentioned that we use the military as a stopgap measure because DHS and CBP were going to build capacity to be able to secure the border. So that was the initial plan. And we're doing that. You've seen all the efforts to increase ICE, to increase Border Patrol. But when it comes to technology, I think autonomy to the extent possible is indispensable nowadays, because every good piece of equipment that we deploy out there requires agents and officers to go man that. That's one thing. The other thing, when we're talking about intelligence or sensors, advanced information. If you're telling me that I have a threat 5 feet from me, it's a little bit too late, right? So how do we push, again, the border out from a surveillance perspective, and being able to take intelligence and information feeds, from either from host countries or from the military ISR type of stuff. There's I heard one of our leaders in CBP that he was looking at working with Mexico to deploy technology way before the vehicle gets to that officer at the port of entry. So what that does is give that officer all the information that he or she needs to be able to make that split-second enforcement decision by the time that vehicle gets there, versus having the vehicle right in front of you and start running the checks and stuff like that when it's in front of you. So those are the two main things: autonomy to the extent possible, and then advanced information, getting that information to those officers at the speed of mission, as we say.
And we're looking at things relatively innocuous. Traffic cams. Yep. Something that simple. There's usually public source. License tag readers. It buys time for that law enforcement officer to make that decision. Traffic patterns going south versus north, and how, the frequency, the time of day, those becomes patterns of life that we've learned a great deal in the military in fighting counterinsurgency for 20 plus years, that can apply to, and law enforcement officers use these technologies and these tactics across America, and it become very valuable. And so I think there's a great deal of opportunity. And by the way, that saves an agent. So if you can put a passive monitoring system, then that agent can be used somewhere else to actually take enforcement action. Yep.
So I mentioned the NDAA earlier, and in this NDAA, there are similar authorities that the Department of War has, that DHS will get, called the Safer Skies Act. Right, and that, because right now there's only the authorities for the monitoring of drones, not the ability to interdict drones. And I think that'll be really, really key, but there's not a lot of time to, when that authority happens between, like, for example, the World Cup, right? And those activities that'll be starting to happen. So quick reaction time. But I know that the team has already been working on figuring that out. I think at this point we'll go to the audience for questions. And so I know we got some microphones that'll come around, but happy to entertain your questions.
I will say first, General, spent time down in your sector, your AOR. I don't think anybody realizes how big that sector is. It's 42 million square miles that you had to take part of. So that was pretty substantial. But the question I have, I guess, is for industry. I always look at it from S&T standpoint at science and technology. We're always telling them when we're working with industry that we vet the technologies. So hearing from the operators, interoperability is a big thing, right? When the national defense areas were established and operational control was mandated, we had this influx of DOW coming in and bringing them into the wars. Now, it was already happening in small scale, but with all this equipment coming in, can you talk about the importance of interoperability, the opportunities for industry as they look at interoperability, what that means, not just interoperability for DOW to DHS, but also interoperability with equipment that they are developing to have an expansion of that market space for them?
Well, one of the challenges that we have is there's so much flow, and this is a common problem that the Department of War has. As your unit is getting organized to deploy, whether it's overseas, you get this tons of equipment thrown at you. By the way, you have to stop and train and train operators and train it and build it back into your systems of operation. How do you use that technology? And so how timely is that technology, and making sure that your training pipeline supports all these technologies? We got to be careful. This is one of the things that I spent a lot of time working with our friends in Sedena, is that our competitors, enemies or whatever you want to call them, are bringing and throwing technology at our partners south of the border. But they don't come with operations and maintenance and training as part of it. Only the United States brings a whole program that helps train, helps sustain, and maintain the equipment. And so that's why you see when you go to Central and South America, you see all this equipment is just pushed over on the side of the runway, just rotting away because there was no training, no operations, O&M part of it. And so that's what's unique about United States, is that when we utilize, it comes as a package. And we have to make sure that package is just in time, but it also is supported by an effective training. And then the operators can then use the information generated to actually make decisions.
And in the NDAA also, foreign military sales reforms, right? Because the foreign military sales, all of us commanders complained about that, how doggone slow it was. Leaders, my own hemisphere, I mean, they're in the seat for like 4 years, one term, 4 years. And they got to make a difference in like a couple months, not a couple years. And that's what foreign military sales was. But then if you, other countries see how quickly we really can do it from Team USA, right? When you have something like what Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then how quickly we can really get military equipment over there. It's pretty doggone fast. So, speeding that up and being able to get those capabilities. But if you think about it, like-minded democracies, I see what's happening in our world with the axis of aggressors working with each other, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. I mean, I could just take Venezuela, who has equipment from all those countries in Venezuela, right? It's just a hub of activity. Our adversaries right there in one place, so close to our homeland. I have testified on the Hill many times and said the first and second island chain to our homeland has already been set by the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and everything that they have done with the Belt and Road projects, the billions of dollars of projects. Partnering with our interagency. Team USA is really powerful when it brings all of its instruments of national power together, diplomacy, information, military, and economics. And our investment in the region, in the Western Hemisphere, that's why I'm glad to see it in the National Security Strategy, because we are not, our US companies and our Western companies aren't competing on the critical infrastructure tenders that come out. Why are we not sharing information with Mexico? We have vetted units in all other countries, you know, what about the vetted units in Mexico? I had an organization underneath me in US Southcom called JIATF South. I'm sure all of you have heard about it one time or another, right? We have LNOs from the region, one LNO military from 17 different countries in that organization. We continue to increase the interdictions that are done every year coming from the Caribbean, Central America, South America, because of that trust that we've built with like-minded democracies. To me, what's happening right now is very clear. It's between autocracy and democracy. China is ready and wakes up every day trying to replace us, Team USA, and the rules-based international order. And they are working with the other axis of aggressors to make that happen every single day. And so as we think about our own critical infrastructure here, we look at what's already happened with cyber. We see the technology availability out there. How quickly can we adapt that? And then how quickly can we iterate that is up to us, right? But we got to figure it out, and we got to figure it out really, really fast. We'll take one more question from the audience, please. Oh, my time's up.
Oh,
We're getting the hook. All right. Everybody, thank you very much. Again, thank you for everything that you do. Appreciate it. Good job.